We're on the road to Reykjavik, Bobby Fischer's road to Reykjavik 1972, and we're covering the candidates final between Bobby Fischer and Tigran Petrosian, played in Buenos Aires in 1971. Well, we're up to game 5 now, which is what we're about to take a look at. Up to game 4, everything even. They traded wins in games 1 and 2. Games 3 and 4 were drawn. Petrosian was criticised for making a fairly short draw with the white pieces in game 4. So they go into game 5 with Fischer playing white. And it's a Petrov from Petrosian. Very solid. And he also plays a very solid variation here. Not the main line with d5, but instead he just puts the knight back straight away, which seems quite passive because obviously white has this space advantage. I suppose, you can argue that black is very solid here. There are no real weaknesses in black's pawn structure. In other words, a typical kind of Petrosian system. h3 from Fischer. Well, normally one criticises such little pawn moves at the side of the board, but this cramps black. Black is unable to play the bishop to g4. And of course, when you have a space advantage, you don't want to allow your opponent to exchange pieces. So h3 is actually a good move here from Fischer. Now, Fischer had actually encountered this system before against the Romanian player Gheorghiu in the Buenos Aires tournament in 1970, a year before. And let me just show you very quickly what happened over the next few moves. Gheorghiu played rook e8. And you can see that Gheorghiu put this knight on c6. But actually, Fischer got a really pleasant position in a moment just by pushing forward with d5, getting a big space advantage. He managed to get that knight into d4 and set up a nice initiative on the king side. You can see that diagonal is weak. But Petrosian had obviously studied this position and found a different setup for black. Setup that Smyslov also used, actually. So first of all, c6, well, that's directed against this pawn move d5 that could potentially come later. And now instead of, obviously the knight can't go to c6 now, but he played the knight to d7. Bishop f4, so Fischer is repeating this setup used against Gheorghiu. Of course, a very sensible move. The bishop looks good on this diagonal. And now we can see that the difference is that black packs out the king side with this knight. So certainly no weakness with pawn to h6, not in this position. Very, very solid for black. Knight can come to g6 to block the diagonal, maybe to e6, depends. But it's just put out of the way for the moment, and obviously, it means the king is more secure. And a6 from Petrosian. So who knows? He might want to play b5. Petrosian typically playing in a very kind of cat and mouse way, just hanging back behind those first 3 ranks. And here, well, Fischer played queen b3. Now, he was mildly criticised for that move. Many moves were recommended here for white instead of queen b3. There's b4, for example. Petrosian himself mentioned b4. Furman and Korchnoi thought d5, just gaining space, would be sensible. Queen c instead of queen b3, queen c2, queen d2 also mentioned by Korchnoi. Botvinnik thought a4 is possible. I think the problem with queen b3 is that b5 can potentially come, and the queen could be vulnerable in that position to maybe rook b8, maybe even a bishop b6, something like that. well, let's see how things went. Knight e6 from Petrosian, and the bishop dropped back to h2. That was actually criticised by Korchnoi, who felt that the bishop, well, subsequently was out of play, and he was probably right. He felt that bishop e3 was a better move, supporting the d-pawn, but also having some influence over the queen side as well. So anyway, bishop h2. I mean, it sort of feels okay to be still on this diagonal, but let's see what happened. Now, if b5, then the queen will probably just come back to c2. Bishop f8 from Petrosian, so still playing in a very cagey way. And here, Botvinnik thought a4 was sensible. And he said white should have played a4, but Fischer apparently believed his position was superior and did not want to take any difficult decisions. Well, it's true that for every pawn move, you could say that creates weaknesses. Pawns can't move backwards. There's potentially a weakness on b4. Nevertheless, well, it seems sensible to restrict black's play with a4 guarding against a potential b5 later, or indeed immediately. So Fischer played rook e2 and b5. And basically the Soviet commentators just thought that Fischer just wasn't very familiar with his position, and he was kind of at sea. Well, I think that impression is correct with queen b3 and queen c2. By the way, I'm taking as my source, my main source here is this book which I've mentioned before, Russians versus Fischer, very interesting, published in the mid-90s, and gives a lot of archive material that certainly wasn't published before. So Petrosian develops, and rook e1 looks sensible to connect those rooks again. I mean, of course, this cannot be a bad position for white. White is still pretty well coordinated. But there was just that moment of hesitation that Fischer had. And g6 also looks good. That bishop wants to emerge, perhaps on g7, perhaps on h6. Now, quite a few moves here from white are possible. b3 looks sensible just to give that pawn protection. You could also play a3. Fischer plays b4, and that certainly allows black some counterplay. Even a5 is possible here, but this is what Petrosian played. Now d5 is interesting. It's not the kind of move that Petrosian would be drawn to, as it's a little bit anti-positional. However, if you can grab a pawn, that's another matter. But rook b1 is tricky. Well, lots of tactics start from here, but basically, in this position, white has very, very good compensation for the pawn. That bishop in this position looks amazing. Oh, Petrosian in this position just played knight to c7, so he's starting to get some control over b5 and in particular d5. And now, well, several commentators thought that this was necessary, and Korchnoi, for example, thought that white was slightly better in this position. But black is still very solid. But Fischer played bishop b3. Now that's real hesitation, actually. He's obviously not on the best of form at the moment in the match so far. Petrosian exchanged rooks and put the knight in on d5. And he's starting to gain some control in this position. The initiative is turning towards Petrosian now. Fischer played a3 here. It was felt that he should have taken. The idea, of course, is to recapture with the pawn, and that gives black's knight a nice outpost on e4, whereas for white, that outpost is covered by the pawn on d6. So even though these pawns look, well, slightly odd, doubled, isolated pawns. In fact, that both pawns do a really good job of controlling key squares in the position. But Fischer played a3, but things actually get worse, because after a5, nice minority attack against those pawns. In fact, things are worse for white in this position because one of those pawns is going to be isolated. b5. Now, of course, if Fischer could play a4, everything would be fine, but a4 is an excellent move. Just making sure that those pawns don't connect. Pawn on b5 is now cut off from its brother on the a file. If that's taken, then this gives black a really nice initiative. Basically, that bishop is a bit loose. If we could protect it with a pawn, that would be another matter. That knight is potentially able to come into e4. White's king is actually a bit insecure on the back rank. This is a very pleasant position for black, a very nice initiative with the major pieces potentially infiltrating. And don't forget that bishop can maybe shoot out h6. Big difference between the white king here and the black king. Petrosian's king completely safe, and you can see all white's pieces kind of blocked out of the game, whereas black's coming into the game. Looks good for black. So a4 just played, and Fischer wisely didn't take that pawn, so he dropped the bishop back to a2. Now, queen b6 was played, starting to gang up on the stranded b pawn here. Queen a5 was possible. In fact, Petrosian after the game thought he should have played queen a5. Furman and Korchnoi also thought queen a5 was good. I mean, one potential idea is after this to play rook c8, gaining control here, and then knight e4. I mean, black certainly has a nice initiative there. Let's go back. So anyway, queen b6 also pleasant. Queen b1 is a very good move to protect that pawn. Queen d3 looks more natural. Problem is that in this position, well, this pawn is going to drop, because after rook b2 we can exploit that pin. So that's why queen b1 was played, so that in this position the rook can come across and the queen manages to protect the rook, so bishop a6 isn't possible. But this is a pleasant position for black. And there are various ways to try and make progress. Bishop h6 is possible. Petrosian played knight e4, which looks very nice, but actually allows Fischer back in. Knight e8 was suggested, with the idea of coming into c7 to take the b5 pawn. I mean, white can confuse the issue here. It's not so clear actually as many commentators at the time said. For example, let's see, rook b4 and now queen c2. This pawn is a little bit vulnerable, and if knight takes b5, well, in fact queen b2 is a little bit problematic for black. So there are ways to try and target, to try and confuse the situation. But of course, black doesn't have to rush into taking that pawn. And there's no doubt that white is under pressure here. Anyway, knight e4 played by Petrosian. He was running a little bit shorter on time than Fischer. You could see on the previous move, 1 hour 31 consumed by Fischer, 2 hours 2 minutes consumed by Petrosian. Time control in those days was 40 moves in 2.5 hours. And here is where the fight back starts. Knight c3 looks very promising, but in fact it's okay for white. Petrosian took here, and that led to simplifications. But let's just have a look at knight takes bishop. That's obviously quite critical. Taking a bishop, although that bishop wasn't particularly well placed. But what happens if you take a pawn? Well, here there's a couple of things. Botvinnik thought queen c7 would offer some counterplay, and certainly on the dark squares that's problematic for black. Rook b2 is also interesting. And then again, it's not so great. Suddenly that bishop, which sometimes comes out, but in this position, somehow the initiative has switched round, and this is suddenly a little bit tricky. Black has to be quite careful here. Well, and so on. For example, after this, well, you can exchange off all the pieces, and that will be a draw. I mean, this line was given by Swaytin, who was one of Petrosian's seconds during the match, and that's an equal position. So it seems as though Fischer is over the worst here. In the game, Petrosian simplified. I think this is a very different situation to the one we saw before. So that forces off the exchange of forces off the queens as the a pawn is loose. And here, well, Fischer still has to be a bit tricky. There are for a bit careful. There are various tricks. So, for example, bishop takes d5 actually loses a piece to knight c3 with a fork here. But Fischer, with more time, was wise to the problems, and in this position they've just exchanged pawns. Obviously in this symmetrical position they're heading towards a draw very quickly. Let's just take you through the final moves of the game. And in this position they agreed a draw on the offer of Fischer. Well, you can see the clock times at the end of the game. Fischer still had about half an hour remaining. Petrosian had used up 2 hours and 26 minutes, just 4 minutes to get to the time control. So yeah, that shows a bit nervy from Petrosian. Obviously in this position this is completely equal. So well, the nerves continue, I think, for both players. Fischer uncertain at just coming out of the opening as to the best strategy for white to pursue. Petrosian outplaying him, but wasn't able to really capitalise on his slight positional advantage. Here's what Spassky had to say after the game. The course of the fifth game was such that Petrosian outplayed Fischer in a battle of quiet manoeuvring. During the fifth hour of play, when Petrosian ought to have taken vigorous steps to reap the fruits of his strategy, he was unable to do so, perhaps for reasons of nervous strain. It was then that I voiced the view that Fischer was so far not visible in this match, and predicted that it was more likely that Petrosian would lose the match than that Fischer would win it. Nonetheless, the unforeseen happened. So that was Boris Spassky talking about this game. I think, Spassky knows both players very well, and in particular at this time, Petrosian. He had 2 World Championship matches against Petrosian, and understands the psychology, understands the mentality of Petrosian incredibly well. And, well, I think he was just about right there. Seems to me that, yeah, both players are nervous at the start of this match, but maybe Petrosian a little bit more than Fischer. Anyway, we'll see what happened very soon in Game 6. Do check out the other videos concerning the match, and remember, do like, comment, share and subscribe, and if you want to support the channel, do check out the links to PayPal or Patreon.com. Thanks for watching.